This is Land of Havilah, Isaiah 34. It's an end-time prophecy of the great day of God's wrath. Verse 1. Come near, you nations, to hear. Listen, you peoples. Let the earth and all it contains hear, the world and everything that comes from it. Comment, Isaiah says all the earth should listen to this prophecy, including the Goyim in verse 1. Goyim's translated into English as nations, but it specifically means Gentile nations. All the earth, including the Gentile nations, should listen. Verse 2. For Yahweh is enraged against all the nations, and angry with all their armies. He has utterly destroyed them. He's given them over for slaughter. The slain will also be cast out, and the stench of their dead bodies will come up, and the mountains will melt in their blood. All of the army of the sky will be dissolved. The sky will be rolled up like a scroll, and all its armies will fade away as a leaf fades from off the vine or a fig tree. For my sword has drunk its fill in the sky. Behold, it will come down on Edom and on the people of my curse for judgment. Yahweh's sword is filled with blood. It's covered with fat, with the blood of lambs and goats, and with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For Yahweh has a sacrifice in Bozrah and a great slaughter in the land of Edom. Comment in verse 2, Yahweh is enraged against all the nations, which is again Goyim in Hebrew, meaning Gentile nations. The singular of that in Hebrew is goy, meaning one foreigner, one non-Israelite. Digging into that term a little deeper, Goyim is God's code word, we might say, for the cursed of any nation. It includes some who were born Israelites but were cut off from Israel. That term cut off first appears in Genesis 17:14, that a male who's uncircumcised will be cut off from his people. And again in Exodus 12:15, anyone who doesn't celebrate the Passover will be, quote, cut off from Israel, end quote. Therefore, a person who's an Israelite by birth and by genetic inheritance could, from a spiritual perspective, be a goy, and it could work the other way around. Someone who's a goy by birth and by nationality could be adopted into Israel. In Exodus 12:19, for example, Moses said a resident foreigner could participate in the Passover and be included in the congregation of Israel. So some Israelites, according to the flesh, are actually spiritual Goyim, and some Goyim, according to the flesh, are actually spiritual Israelites. In New Testament terminology, we could think of spiritual Israel and the spiritual Goyim as the saved and unsaved. So whenever God speaks of Israel or Goyim, he doesn't care about genetics or the country of one's birth. He only cares about the spirit. Anyone of any nationality is cut off if he doesn't believe, and he's included among the people of God if he does believe. These are the only Israel and Goyim that matter in the final summary of things. Which brings us to the term Edom in verse 6. Edom's another name for Esau, Jacob's twin brother, who cast away his blessing, Genesis 25:30. And Jacob is another name for Israel, Genesis 32:28. Those brothers, according to the flesh, are prototypes of the great divide in our world between the blessed and those who cast off the blessing, between spiritual Israel and spiritual Goyim. The original Israel and Edom didn't get along. They were oil and water. Israel received the blessing, and as for Esau, there was no blessing left. Israel got everything, Edom got nothing. They were prototypes. The blessed will inherit everything, the rest will inherit nothing. God's anger rests on Edom, his blessing rests on Israel. They're the saved and unsaved, which is necessary in understanding this chapter that in verse 2, for example, quote, Yahweh is enraged against all the nations, all the Goyim. He's utterly destroyed them. He's given them over for slaughter, end quote. Destruction is the fate of the Goyim, which in Genesis was represented by the one man, Edom. Now the chapter becomes understandable. It's the great day of God's wrath against the unsaved, against Edom, against the nations who counted their blessing as nothing, who despised their blessing. It's the great day of God's wrath against everyone who cast off the blessing. In verse 4, quote, the army of the sky will be dissolved, the sky will be rolled up like a scroll, end quote. The army of the sky first appeared in Deuteronomy 4:19. God commanded in that verse, don't worship the army of the sky, the sun, moon, and stars, end quote. According to that, the army of the sky are the heavenly objects we see above, but they're also objects of worship and service. They who worship false gods actually worship demons, Deuteronomy 32:17. Paul called Satan and the demons, quote, spiritual forces of wickedness in heavenly places, Ephesians 6:12. So the army of the sky brings in not only the image of the sun, moon, and natural sky, it also brings in demons and Satan into the conversation. So the army of the sky being dissolved is a double image of the natural sky being dissolved, 2 Peter 3:10, and it speaks of judgment on Satan and the demons. In the next verse, there's another clue that God's not just talking about the natural sun, moon, and stars, quote, my sword has drunk its fill in the sky, end quote. So God was angry with whatever he's talking about up there. He wouldn't be angry with just heavenly objects. They must represent something deeper. In another chapter of Isaiah, chapter 51, verse 6, quote, raise your eyes to the sky, then look to the earth beneath, for the sky will vanish like smoke, and the earth will wear out like a garment, and its inhabitants will die in the same way, but my salvation will be forever, and my righteousness will not fail, end quote. And there are many similar echoes in the Scripture of the present universe being destroyed and God bringing all things associated with this world and the gods of this world to a final judgment and destructive conclusion. Isaiah 13:13, Ezekiel 32:7, verses 7 to 8, Joel 2:31, Matthew 24:29, 2 Peter 3:10, Revelation 6:14, and Revelation 21:1. In verses 2 to 6, there is a great slaughter of mankind, specifically of the nations in verse 2, Edom in verse 5, and Edom again in verse 6. Everyone who cast off the blessing will be involved in that bloodbath. God won't have any reservations about it. He speaks about Edom with no respect whatsoever, and about the nations with no respect. The stench of their dead bodies will come up. The mountainsides will flow with their blood. God's sword will drink its fill of blood. He'll slaughter Edom like slaughtering lambs, goats, and rams. Bozrah in verse 6 is a city in Edom, Genesis 36:33. It's a representative city of the unsaved world. Coming up, speaking of the great slaughter, God continues to liken it to the slaughtering of animals, verse 7. The wild oxen will come down with them, and the young bulls with the mighty bulls, and their land will be drunken with blood, and their dust made greasy with fat. For Yahweh has a day of vengeance, a year of recompense for the cause of Zion. Comment in verse 8, the judgment of the wicked is for the cause of Zion. It's in the interest of God's people. This is a cleansing of evil. In verse 8, for Yahweh has a day of vengeance, end quote. The fact that he has a day of vengeance is testimony of how long he waited. He's slow to anger. He's been patient with man generation after generation. Coming up, the landscape of Edom morphs into a picture of eternal hell, verse 9. Its streams will be turned into pitch, its dust into sulfur, and its land will become burning pitch. It won't be quenched night or day. Its smoke will go up forever. Comment, the fire, sulfur, and burning that won't be quenched night or day, and smoke that goes up forever is repeated in Revelation 14:11 and 12. Those who worship the beast and his image will be cast in that place. Coming up, God has so little regard for the people he's put there, he won't acknowledge them. The place is empty as far as he's concerned. He refers to the inhabitants as wild animals. Still in verse 10. From generation to generation it will lie waste. No one will pass through it forever and ever. But the pelican and the porcupine will possess it. The owl and the raven will dwell in it. He'll stretch the line of confusion over it and the plumb line of emptiness. They shall call its nobles to the kingdom, but none shall be there, and all its princes shall be nothing. Comment in verse 12, they shall call its nobles to the kingdom, but none shall be there, which means they'll wish someone noble would take command of the place, but there won't be anyone noble. All its princes shall be as nothing. Everyone will be powerless. Verse 13. Thorns will come up in its palaces, nettles and thistles in its fortresses, and it will be a habitation of jackals, a court for ostriches. The wild animals of the desert will meet with the wolves, and the wild goat will cry to his fellow. Yes, the night creature shall settle there, and shall find herself a place of rest. The arrow snake will make her nest there, and lay, hatch, and gather under her shade. Yes, the kites will be gathered there, every one with her mate. Search in the book of Yahweh and read, not one of these will be missing. None will lack her mate, For my mouth has commanded, and his Spirit has gathered them. He's cast the lot for them, and his hand has divided it to them with a measuring line. They shall possess it forever. From generation to generation they will dwell in it. Comment in verse 16, speaking of the animals of the place, quote, search the book of Yahweh and read, none of these will be missing. Okay, let's do that. We have an electronic Bible. Let's search the book of Yahweh to see if the animals Isaiah named are there. Starting in verse 11, the animals that possess the place are the pelican, which we find in Deuteronomy 14:17, porcupine, found in Leviticus 11:27, owl, Leviticus 11:16-18, raven, Leviticus 11:15, jackal, Leviticus 11:27, ostrich, Deuteronomy 14:15, wolf, Leviticus 11:17, wild goat, Deuteronomy 14:15, snake, Leviticus 11:42, and kite, Leviticus 11:14. They're all listed in the law of Moses as animals that are unclean and unlawful to eat. The one exception is the wild goat, which is clean and can be eaten, but there's another wild goat in Yahweh's book. In the Day of Atonement ceremony, Leviticus 16, the priest was to place his hands on a goat's head, transferring all the sins of Israel to the goat, and the goat was released into the wild. That wild goat full of sin would be unclean. Isaiah's point was that everyone who belongs there will be there because they were unclean. In verse 16, not one animal will be missing or lack her mate. In verse 16, the animals will be there, quote, for my mouth has commanded and his Spirit has gathered them, end quote, meaning God will gather all who belong there and he'll put them there. They were people, but now God won't acknowledge them as such. In verse 17, God has cast lots for them. It's not that he randomly chose them to be there. He's in charge of how the lot comes out, Proverbs 16:33, so it's not random. It's according to his judgment that they're there. He allotted them to the place. It's not anything approximate or willy-nilly. God measured it with the measuring line in verse 17. Isaiah 35 is next.